Next to me is the grave of Colonel V.A. Clawhammer Witcher, and he is one of the most unusual, probably psychopathic people in all of the Civil War. Now, this really begins in 1860 when he had a blood feud with two brothers who lived in the same county as him in rural southern Virginia. And this feud came to a head when the two families went to court. The grandfather of the family that he was feuding with went to go testify, and the grandfather pulled out a pistol after being called a liar, and Witcher grabbed him by the arm and said, "Shoot! Shoot, damn you!" And so his family just began shooting. And then, of course, the people that he was feuding with began shooting back, and there was a shootout. But what makes this unusual is that his family won, and they disemboweled and mutilated the bodies of the men that they were feuding with, the two brothers, as well as the grandfather. And they were acquitted in court. And when the Civil War came, Witcher created a group of partisans called Witcher's Boys. And at the time, southwestern Virginia was very heavily Union sympathizing because they were so poor. They didn't really have an interest in defending the planter class, or the plantation owners, and a lot of people were acting as spies for the Union, which was not very far away. And eventually, Witcher's Boys became known for their brutality. They had something specifically that they loved using called a Witcher's roll. And Witcher's roll is when they would tie a man up and tie a noose around his neck, and then pull a tree back with a horse, and then cut the rope, and the head would just pop off. Another method that he loved to use was just grabbing them by the head and bashing them against a stone until literally their head caved in and their brains fell out on the floor. And in one of these cases, it said that he had his men dip their fingers in the man's brain and smear it under the nose of his widow. Now, in 1862, he was being tried for war crimes by the Confederacy, and he was also given legitimacy. Witcher's Boys were, in spite of calls from Confederate politicians saying that they're nothing but murderers and thieves, Witcher's Boys were given the official status as 34th Cavalry. Well, at least that's according to unhinged films. Here it says it is the 37th and 38th Battalion Cavalry Virginia Confederate States Army, but either way, they were involved in some pretty brutal massacres. The Livestone Cove Massacre, which was the smashing of the brains out. And when he was being called for war crimes, the wife held up a little glass of spirits with her husband's brain in it and jokingly said, "Would you like some water to wash down that lie?" At least that's the Atun Shen video again talking about this. But after the war, in 1865, Witcher surrendered. During the war, his troops were pretty well massacred by Colonel Custer's troops, but he went to surrender in one of the larger built-up cities in the area and evaded all calls for his trial for war crimes, and eventually he just went to Utah. He became a lawyer in Virginia for a while, but he went to Utah to get away from the Yankee bastards. Those were his words. And then he came back in his late life and was buried here in 1912. But this blood feud is kind of evidenced by the fact that his family was very heavily involved in local politics, and you still have these rural areas of southern Virginia, West Virginia, that have almost no electricity. I've passed through some very poor communities here, and families get tied to a place, and there are still witchers in the local area. And one last little fact about this man that I think is really interesting. There's a bunch of facts. Watch the Atun Shen video, but he never used any punctuation when he wrote. And he was called Clawhammer not because of the fist of death that he was, but because he always wore around a clawhammer coat. And this was high fashion dress, and he wore it all the time. So Atun Shen would say he's just a weird guy. And he was a psychopath, he was a partisan, and he was a war criminal, but he was really weird. And he fought for the Confederate Army. They sent him like a missile to these rural communities of southwestern Virginia, and he was known as a villain by pro-Confederate and anti-Confederate forces. He was just a real wild card here in the forests of Virginia.